Are you the good guy if you stand up against a hate crime law? If Ukraine joins NATO, will that be the start of World War III? And did World War II provide an outline of how Israel could now defeat Hamas? We answer these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome back to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through the internet to find the best takes and the worst takes and talk about what we like or dislike. My name is Donald and I'm here with my co-host Britt. As a reminder, just give us a follow at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Like and share and comment if you are inclined to do so. Helps us out a ton and we really do appreciate it. Okay, our first take, it shows a quote retweet from a first person with an image of a protest against the Hate Crime Act outside the Scottish Parliament. And the quote tweet reads, "Imagine protesting against a hate crime act and still thinking you're the good guys." All right, what do you make?
Yeah, so some background on this for viewers and listeners that aren't familiar. Like Scotland just passed the Hate Crime Act, which essentially criminalizes your ability to speak about whether you think a man is a man or a woman is a woman. Kind of the whole thing that Jordan Peterson had been talking about with Bill C-16 in Canada. And I mean, this is kind of run of the mill classic, like, oh, well, the name of the bill is this, so therefore, if you're against the bill, then you're against this good thing, even though no one is really actually arguing about the substance of what's in the actual bill. It's like we've talked about all the time, saying like, hey, the Patriot Act is actually very unpatriotic and un-American, and being like, well, what do you mean? It's actually called the Patriot Act. Like, of course it's patriotic. You know, a lot of times what we do in society with, especially with some of this stuff, like we criminalize like literally having an opinion, and people that get into power in government will leverage the legislation to enforce it so that it's actually against the law to have an opinion on X thing because it might be detrimental to something that they want to get through or to some agenda that they might have. And they use the force of the state to do that. And one of the key aspects of doing that is they need to make sure that whatever type of legislation they're pushing through, it has to be named something. So it's like, how could you ever be against this thing, right? We're literally debating, like people that are out there protesting at outside of the Scottish Parliament are literally just saying like, hey, I think we should be able to call men, men, and women, women. Like, regardless of whether or not like that is, if you just throw away the hate crime side of it aside, like just put that aside and just be like, do you think that's something that's worthy of discussion? Whether we should be talking about whether men are men and women are women and how we define these terms, like these biological realities that we all function within, that we're born with, that we, you know, one of the biggest aspects of the human experience with sexuality, like that's one of the largest things that we'll ever experience. Like, don't you think we should be able to talk about that? And what this Hate Crime Act actually is saying like, no, we don't want you to have any opinions about it other than the opinions that we have approved for you. And to speak out against that is a hate crime and is something that can put you in jail. So yeah, they are the good guys, right? They are advocating for actual discussion about this really important subject. And it's kind of, you know, a sign of the times that we're at this point where, you know, this type of discussion about whether men are men and women are women is considered a hate crime. It's probably because we've been so milquetoast on actually putting a line in the sand and saying like, no, we should be able to discuss these things.
The funny thing about this is, you know, saying imagine protesting against a hate crime act. That you're just assuming the perspective already, because this law would make certain types of things a crime, and
Yes.
it defines certain things as hateful. So even the framing of this issue that the person poses here, it's they're already arguing on their ground. It'd be like me saying, "Hey, we're all gonna go we're all gonna go to the store together," and then someone being like, "Actually, I'm gonna stay at home," and me saying like, "How are you gonna be able to stay home if you're already at the store?"
Yeah.
It's like, you know, if I'm already presuming that we've all come to this conclusion, and the whole point of this is that no, we're actually disagreeing that one, these things are hateful, and two, that they should be crimes. Now, this post might even make more sense if it was if the whole thing was to specifically making hating people a crime. But first of all, as you I think defined, even we're not even at that point. We're just talking about saying that and speaking in very definite terms. Even having a debate over it would be qualified as hateful. And
Yes.
that's the first problem, right? Is you're defining something as hate that is not hateful. But so that's the first area where this, again, they're presuming their perspective already and then saying, wow, if you're against this, you support hatefulness. But even still, even if this was only about making it illegal to hate someone, that is also not a good justification to create crime, because that is always an ever moving post of what you define as hate. And the whole idea of having freedom of expression and freedom of thought, in a liberal order, in a liberal society, the entire point is that you don't have to get along with people insofar as your personal opinions. You just can't physically do anything. You can't harm them. You can't steal from them. You can't treat them in a way that deprives them of their rights naturally. But that doesn't mean that you're forced to love and like everybody in the same way that being against I don't know, someone who voted for Donald Trump, saying that they're a stupid person. Like, does that count as a hate crime? Should that be liable to be arrested for that? I mean, I know this is obviously happening in Scotland, but you get the point. Hate is a very nebulous term. It's a very wide-reaching thing, and the moment we start policing people's thoughts is the moment that you give the people in power all the control they want over you. And so that's a terrible standard, even still, even if we were debating the hate crime. And so the fact that that shouldn't be criminalized is another assumption that they're making, which is, oh, you're defending hate crimes. And it's like, no, we're saying that, one, what we're talking about isn't hateful, and two, hate should not even be a crime. So this, don't get confused and tripped up like, wow, that does sound really bad for us. It's like, no, this actually is a very cheap debate tactic to try to get you to be in a less comfortable position defending yourself and your views.
Yeah, it's always funny. We've talked about this before, how the intended purpose or the spirit of the law that they will eventually end up in is almost never addressed in the actual legislation that they put forward. Because I think you and I would both agree, it's like, hey, like, I don't want someone, even if I don't agree with like that they are a man, they think they're a woman, and I'm like, no, you're biologically a man, so you're a man. I still would not want that person killed or violently harmed for that, lifestyle choice that they've made. Like, I want them. The reason I am saying these things is because I want them to live a better life and live a more fulfilled life. But that aside, like, that's what these proponents of these types of bills eventually end up at. They're like, well, we need to pass this because like people are going to be killed and this and this and that. And it's like, well, why? We already have laws against murder. We already have laws against violently harassing someone and persecuting them. And then they go and pass these laws like the Hate Crime Act. And it's like, well, it actually has nothing to do with the actual end result that they're desiring to have happen. And I think if you like think about that for a long time and think about it long and hard, be like, oh, okay, like maybe it's meant for something other than what its intended purpose is. Like, it's not by accident or by mistake. It's by design, and it's because they're actually trying to get at something different than the actual thing that we all want, which is to people live long and healthy, fulfilled lives.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And the other, when you're talking about the unintended, or not the unintended, the spirit of the law there, um, when they're saying they're doing it out of charity because even the thought of people being hateful towards someone else is something they can't fathom. The problem is that is a motive assumption that is happening too, in the same way where, you and I saying that we want them to have a better life, right? And by saying, hey, you're actually going to be deeply unhappy in this way, like, we care about the people around us. We want a society of people who are healthy and doing well. And so they're kind of on the other side of that, where they're saying, oh, well, we want a society where people don't hate each other. But the difference is, when I am advocating for someone to live well and saying, hey, I actually don't think this is right, I might make them uncomfortable with my speech, but I'm also not criminalizing the behavior. Whereas when I'm saying something that makes someone else uncomfortable, they're saying, nope, you deserve to be thrown in a jail cell. And so you have to recognize that at a certain point, one, you're always going to think that your own judgments are valid, and the perfect delineation of you are just and you are not, but recognize that we're fallible. And so, maybe there's a chance that my perspective shifts on this in the future. I don't think it will, but I'm also not going to say I'm so confident in every single one of my beliefs that we need to lock people up in a prison cell who disagree with me or who go contrary to my views. I don't think that's a good way to operate society, because we are fallible creatures with fallen wills and fallen faculties of reasoning. So I think you also have to recognize that just because you think you can judge the internal metrics of why someone does something or how something comes across does not make it a good justification for imprisonment or criminality. Okay, and speaking of being humble, our next post here is a video from us, and he's referencing us discussing the Christ is King phenomenon. And so he says, let me stop you right there. James Lindsay didn't say you can't say Christ is king. Andrew Klavan didn't say you can't say Christ is king. Ben Shapiro didn't say you can't say Christ is king. But atheists spamming Christ is king whenever Ben Shapiro shows his face, yeah, that's scummy. You guys are a little arrogant, considering I seem to be literally the only person who watches any of your videos. Well, thank you for watching our videos. I really do appreciate it. Fortunately, we do have a listener base as well.
Yes.
As well. So.
And he's not the only one. So Nick, yes, we do very much appreciate you watching our videos. You're like one of 10, sometimes one of 20. I think our most watched video has like 1,000 views, and we got a bunch of folks on the other deal. We also try not to be arrogant. Like if you go back far enough, you'll see that we actually like used to dig up our own cringy bad takes and post them and make fun of them.
That was the whole premise. Yeah.
That was the whole premise. Yeah. We literally ran out of them of document, but we could definitely talk about like our own bad takes and bad opinions and bad things we've done throughout the week. But that kind of, we feel like people aren't as interested in us as maybe as much as the takes that we're taking on. So I responded to this on our YouTube and everything, but I thought it'd be worthy of picking apart here, at least for Nick, so I can guarantee that he sees it, because he's literally the only person that watches this, right? But I kind of find it disingenuous when he's like, well, they didn't literally say that you can't say Christ is king. It's like, yeah, they just fired the one person who was saying that actually believed it at the Daily Wire. It's kind of like with the vaccines when they're like, oh, it's totally your choice whether or not you get the COVID vaccine. But if you choose not to get it, that means you're choosing not to go out in public, and you're choosing not to be employed at your job, and you're choosing not to be able to see your family. It's like, yeah, that's kind of a false choice, right? Like that's not actually what it is. And I would agree and concede that, like, yeah, someone's saying something that they don't believe in order to harass another person, that is scummy and awful. In the same way, like if for some reason, like someone was like talking about eating kosher and they didn't actually eat kosher and didn't believe in it, and they're like criticizing Christians for not eating kosher, like that's like just as awful, not just as awful, but it's like just as weird and scummy to be doing that, because you're literally only using that belief that is genuinely held by people to harass someone. So yeah, that is scummy. But the point of the matter is that Candace Owens is a Christian, actually believes that Christ is king, and was fired for it from the Daily Wire, amongst other things. And yeah, none of them said explicitly, you can't say Christ is king. They're just saying like, oh, well, the person with those belief sets is anti-Semitic. And whether or not it actually is anti-Semitic, I think it's really grasping at straws. So you can kind of like take one or two things away from the whole situation. Like one, either you're not allowed to express your Christianity at the Daily Wire, because Christ is king is like the foundational differentiator of Christianity. It's the same. It'd literally be like saying like, hey, Jewish person, like you can still be Jewish, but you can't eat kosher, right? Or hey, Muslim, like you're not allowed to read your religious texts anymore. So it's either that they're not allowed to express your Christianity, or two, they just really didn't like her takes on Israel's slaughter of the Palestinians in Gaza, and they were looking for a dishonest way to get her out. And I really think it's just the latter. And somehow, Christ is King has now been tied into it, and it's kind of on the chopping block. And the post that we were taking on was James Lindsay basically saying like, hey, Christians, this is not the hill worth dying on, right? You guys should just stop saying that, because it's been co-opted by a few bad actors, when literally all of Christianity would say that and drown out that noise. But it's true that what we said in the video is true. Christianity is hostile to Judaism, as it is hostile to every other religion, as every other religion is hostile to every other religion that doesn't agree with a basic foundational tenet of it. So, like they didn't say you can't say that, but they said, oh, if you do say that, then you're anti-Semitic, and you're playing into that, which is the equivalent of being like, oh, you didn't take the COVID jab, therefore you're not allowed to go outside in modern day society.
Exactly. Yeah. And maybe I didn't make it clear in the video itself that he wasn't saying you literally cannot say this. But what he was saying in that post was by saying this and by chanting it, you are being a useful idiot to the crowd that wants to co-opt this for negative reasons. And what I'm saying is that if his message had been, hey, there are people who are co-opting this message and using it for bad, and they should stop doing that, I would agree with him. But his message wasn't that. He was saying that if you say this thing and if you use it as a calling, then you are contributing into this as a dog whistle, so you should not do that. And then of course you always get to, roll back and say, I didn't say you did. I never technically said you can't say that. But it's kind of like me saying, oh, we're at a buffet, Britt, don't, those green beans right there, they taste like poop. Like, oh, I didn't say he couldn't have them, but like clearly I'm discouraging, and my intent is to get Britt to not eat them, right? Which I would recommend no one do because green beans are.
And you literally say you're like by proxy saying like, well, if you eat green beans, then I can basically say you eat poop, right? Like
Right, right. Yeah. And so there's this implicit, like, you are guilty by association. It's one of those things where I did quote retweet James Lindsay, like when I first saw it, with like, oh no, this is terrible. It's terrible that anti-Semites are using this. Let's have everyone say it so that it drowns out the dog whistle. Because that's how you do that. And that's not the takeaway that James Lindsay wants. So because clearly there's sort of three outcomes that can come from James Lindsay's take on Christ is King. The first being, okay, Christ is King is being used by bad actors in anti-Semitic cases, and that's it. Just wanted you to be aware. If that was the takeaway, I would agree with him and say, yes, there are people abusing my favorite saying, Augustine quote, never judge a philosophy by its abuse. Saying it in a way that is harassing and not meaning it can be abusive, sure. But that's not what his take was. The second is saying Christ is King. There's anti-Semitic people who do it, but keep saying it at the current rate. He did not do that. He clearly said that if you play along, then you are somehow guilty. And the third perspective could be, hey, there are some bad actors saying Christ is King. Let's everyone say it so that it loses its dog whistle meaning. And he didn't say that either. So it's clearly that second one where he's trying to discourage. I'm sorry, the second one I said say it the same, but I would say that at the latter. He's clearly trying to discourage people from using it and from changing up that language to, because it's a central belief. He's saying just reword it, just do other things. And I say, no, we should take the language back. We shouldn't try to squirm and avoid because people are using it in a bad way. In fact, use it more and just use it in the right ways and have more people say that. Dilute the dog whistle. A dog whistle doesn't work if it's so popular in the vernacular that people can't use it to secretly communicate a hidden message there. So I could be wrong here. And again, I don't want to come across as arrogant, but I don't think that there, and again, I don't think Andrew Klavan or Ben Shapiro specifically said you can't say Christ is King, but they did very heavily, at least James Lindsay specifically, did heavily discourage its use. And that to me is the problem, because I don't think that we should cede the ground of language to people who want to twist and abuse it. I'm very much of the opinion that you should absolutely keep language to its truest meaning and truest forms, and not language does shift over time, and I think that we need to be careful about that shift. And you want to keep precise meanings, precise language, and when people control the language, they can control the debate. And so if you start controlling the phrase Christ is King, everyone around should use it in its truest meaning, that Christ is King of our lives, not some anti-Semitic phrase specifically to harass someone. Otherwise, again, you're ceding the ground to them.
And just to kind of add on to that, like, yes, Andrew Klavan never said you can't say Christ is King, but he did say you shouldn't and can't say Christ is King specifically to Ben Shapiro. And I find it difficult to believe, like Andrew Klavan, I think he proclaims to be Catholic or Protestant? Anglican. I find that somewhat hard to believe when in his episode where he addresses this, he literally talks about how like he thinks the world would be a worse place if Ben Shapiro did convert to Christianity. That is just not the perspective of an actual professing Christian. And by association with that, right? Like he was using that in the time. He's like saying, hey, saying Christ is King to someone like Ben Shapiro is anti-Semitic because you're saying that he's no longer God's chosen people. And it would be actually better off if Ben Shapiro didn't become a Christian because it would hurt so much of his family and things like that. And so like that's such an actual like not Christian perspective, because a Christian would say like, no, like the Jews used to be God's chosen people. Only God. Sorry, to clarify, the Jews used to be the only chosen people by God, but now it's been opened up to everyone, and everyone can come to the Father through Jesus Christ. But anyone who denies Jesus Christ is no longer chosen. Like, you can no longer be, you're not a Christian. And so the Jews that have denied Jesus are no longer Christian, or are no longer God's chosen people. And so, like, Candace is expressing like a core tenet of Christianity, and Andrew Clavin is saying you can't express that to Ben Shapiro. And a core tenet of our religion is to express that to people who are not believers. And so, no matter where you spin it, or where you slice it, or where you decide to cut it off at, like, he's literally saying, like, Candace doesn't have, at the Daily Wire at least, that you should not be able to say a key tenet of your belief system and express that to specific people or at all in general. And I think that's as awful as we made it out to be in the episode, and bad as we made it out to be.
Yep, agreed. So again, if that was unclear, that we were saying they weren't literally saying it, but in effect saying it, I think that that's the takeaway. You don't always need to literally say, don't say this thing, to strongly imply, don't say this thing. Okay, our next take comes from David Sachs, who reports Secretary Blinken says that Ukraine will be joining NATO. Under Article 5, this means that an attack on Ukraine will be considered an attack on the United States. If you want World War III, vote Biden in November.
It's a good take. I mean, you and I were talking about this before the show. Hopefully, like, this is the same ilk as they've been, saying for the past many years about Ukraine joining NATO, and it doesn't actually happen. But the premise that this would start World War III, or at the very minimum lead to lots of lives and our entanglements further over there in a way that is very undesirable and awful, is true. And I think just on this pure issue alone, you could justify not voting for whoever supports this, Trump or Biden or whoever. One of the I really have enjoyed listening to Hardcore History by Dan Carlin, and he has this series on World War I and kind of what led to it. And when the founding fathers founded America, they talked about not having entangling alliances because they saw over in Europe the proximity of all these countries to each other and all the alliances that they had meant that people who had no reason to fight would get drawn into conflicts with each other because they had some sort of treaty or thing like that. And the founding fathers were like, wait, we live literally on the other side of the world. There's an ocean between us. Let's not get entangled with these folks so that we can just live here and prosper on our own. And World War I, like, is basically that principle, like, denied on the fullest extent at the maximum. Like, you literally had all of these treaties and alliances that had been entangled, and because of one, a lot of things happening, but like a couple big things occurring where it's like you could have settled this with only a couple hundred people dying. Instead, it was like, nope, we're going to have millions of people die, and everyone that doesn't actually want to fight is going to be forced to be drawn in to fight with each other. And that's literally what NATO is. That's why, like, people of our persuasion, in political persuasion, don't like NATO, because it entangles us with folks on the other side of the ocean that we have no business being entangled with. And it leads to potential risks like this, where it's like, oh, well, if we let Ukraine in, then we're going to be fighting with Russia. And it's like, we'd have no business being over there. We have no quarrel with Russia as it pertains to Ukraine. Maybe our political elite do, and maybe that answers the question of why we're so involved over there. Maybe they don't want things found out. But the general American person, your neighbor, my neighbor, that we don't have any quarrel with a Russian over there. There's no reason for us to be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the other thing about this is that with Ukraine joining NATO, of all things, that is the one. It's not even like this is just a provocative action. It's the provocative action.
Yeah,
it's the if anyone's listened to Dave Smith, they'll know. He beats the drum of this every time. The "niet" means "niet" memo. But like, our U.S. foreign policy was it George Herbert Walker Bush, I think, back then, where we're settling with Russia, and we're trying to negotiate this, and that was the red line, the thing that we absolutely could not do, and that was the one thing they're willing to compromise and to make settlements and where they can, but the one thing was that Ukraine cannot join NATO. And so even if you are sympathetic to the notion of we want to keep Russia curbed and at bay because they're a big dangerous threat, well, it doesn't make sense that where we're going to stand our ground is on the one thing that they've outlined from the beginning will set them off. Now, if your perspective is that Russia won't stop at Ukraine, well, frankly, then the reality is that we probably shouldn't be arms backing Ukraine at this point without getting involved. So right now we're sort of going halfway, which is terrible. But the other perspective is that we don't know that he's going to be, and there's no real evidence to indicate that he would keep going for the whole world. And so at that point, you shouldn't be doing specific things that are going to bait us into a conflict. Now, if he starts pushing beyond Ukraine and he starts doing things that are going to threaten, actual European allies or the US, then maybe it makes sense to step in at that point. You'd have to evaluate the specific actions taken. But before then, it's all it is it's just foolhardy, right? You're just provoking for the sake of provoking, which seems really, really dangerous. I fail to see in what world this is a logical or rational thing to do.
Yeah, that's the irony of it, right? Which is the justification they use for having Ukraine join NATO is like actually defeated by the act of Ukraine joining NATO.
Right.
It's like we would have no choice if Russia decided to put missiles in Mexico and was asking Mexico to join some big alliance where aggression would happen if it was occurred upon anyone, because we'd never allow that right at our doorstep. And as we've talked about on the show before, like Hillary Clinton talking about how Russia is pushing up against NATO's doorstep, and it's like, well, no, actually, NATO moved right next to Russia, got right up in its face, and was like screaming at it, like, "Don't you get any closer to me?" And it's like, yeah, that is going to be provoking. Like, eventually, you're going to do something, and that's not to justify the atrocities that are happening to Ukraine, but it's just like, hey, like we live in a practical reality where Russia feels threatened, and if we truly want there to be less hostility, and we truly want them to feel like they can pull back, like what good does it do for us to continue to push the envelope that has gotten us to the results that we have today? And it's like, what is it called? It's the pragmatist school of foreign policy, or the realist, I think is what it is actually.
Oh, yeah. I had like Realpolitik from like Kissinger stuff.
Yeah. Well, not Kissinger, but I think there's like the actual like realist, which is like, hey, like if you, Tom Woods had a guy on, I can't remember his name, but basically talking about like, hey, like when you have like this idealist standpoint that like, oh, you're supposed to honor this treaty and I come here and I can be right and do this and do that, as opposed to the real understanding that like, hey, if we literally put NATO on in Ukraine, like they're going to have to respond. Like acknowledging that reality is what's important. It's and actually gets results. And if you actually cared about the people in Ukraine that are dying, like you would live and do your policy according to that.
Right. And the other aspect that came to mind is if we're putting the how do I say this? If the foreign policy establishment and like weapons manufacturers and arms manufacturers want war with Russia for their own benefit, it benefits them to paint Russia as this war-hungry country, regardless of how good or bad a guy Putin actually is. And I do think he is not a good guy. Like, to be clear, I don't think he is a laudable individual. But we also have to recognize that it is in the interest of those people in the United States to make sure that our perspective is that Russia is this very aggressive, war-hungry country. And now, when we're doing all of these things, the moment that they lash back, we can say, oh, look, we knew it the whole time. Russia is just trying to be aggressive. All we did was try to include Ukraine in a peaceful treaty, when one, that was the number one thing we do. But two, like, I don't know. Looking at the history of the United States, would we put it past us to cause some kind of incursion in Ukraine, do some minor thing that could be considered an attack that would justify involvement with Russia? Even if we weren't content to just push up against their door and say, hey, by the way, we're, the United States is here. I mean, I don't know. I'm not saying that the United States would, but we look at the history and you can see all kinds of things where the US goes in and does terrible acts in the name of getting the foreign policy results that it wants. And so it is not entirely unfathomable to me that there would be a scenario in which doing this then allows us to stage what would be considered an attack in Ukraine, and having Russia take the blame for it, because I don't know. I don't trust the United States government enough to not do that. When you
Yeah.
look at the history of the CIA, you look at the history even of the FBI, and just in general our foreign policy blunders and frankly immoral actions. We've not had a good track record, in particular in the last like 3 or 4, 5 decades. And so I, all this is doing really is giving more fertile ground to that kind of thing, which is not ideal, I don't think.
No.
Okay, we've got Dave Smith take with a response. So Dave Smith tweets, as the Israeli assault on Gaza becomes even more transparently indefensible, I'd like to take on the 3 main justifications that I get the most. Number 1, they have to finish the job. Hamas must be defeated. The obvious moral hypocrisy of believing that you are justified in killing babies to maybe kill some terrorists aside, this argument demonstrates a complete lack of understanding about what creates terrorism. Pat Buchanan said that terrorism is the price of empire. I think it's the price of domination over other people. Honestly, how hard is it to put yourself in their shoes? If someone killed your baby, would you be ready to go kill someone over it? What Israel has done to Gaza since October guarantees more Hamas or Hamas-like groups. And then I don't know if this is a direct response to Dave's tweet or if it's just a response in general. But this person writes, "Where are all the Nazi or Japanese terror attacks? We killed an awful lot of their babies, but we also defeated them and they surrendered. Then they moved forward and are prosperous and at peace with us."
Yeah. So it was a direct reply to Dave Smith's take. They were mainly replying to the number 1. If anyone wants to go search for Dave Smith's tweet, the rest of it, he has 3 points and they're all very good, but they were mainly replying to number 1. People have like such a weird way of deciding which part of history like they include in their analysis, and maybe we're guilty of that too, and I'm sure we have been at some point. But like this person talks about like, well, where are all the Nazi and Japanese terror attacks? And they're like, well, World War II like came about because Nazi Germany got smashed after the United States entered the war for World War I. And we said, hey, it's all your fault. We're going to, not only did we, destroy a lot of you, but we're going to leverage, we are the winners, you are the losers. We're going to leverage all of this financial burden and guilt and war guilt upon you. And that paved the way for them to have a spirit of vengeance against the rest of the world, right? Like World War I was, like I said in the earlier post, was like the result of all these entanglements and treaties and things like that. World War II, the Nazis decided to go to war with the world because they were angry at the world, somewhat justifiably and in many other ways very much wrongly. But you can't deny that sentiment was put there because we had been destroying and leveraged that burden upon them. And so, this person, for them to say that, it's like, yeah, like the second time we went in and we won World War II and everything, we had like a plan to rebuild, because we even our elites that decided that they wanted to destroy the world recognized that, like, hey, if we don't like go in and actually provide some infrastructure and help rebuild Europe, like this is just going to happen again in 20 years because another people group is going to be aggrieved. And so kind of like I was talking about with the realism, like you can be right or you can be real about things. And here's what I mean by that. Like when my wife and I were traveling in Portugal, like there are these guys when you're driving through the city, and they have like, if there's an open parking space, they'll like kind of like shoo you into the parking space, like they saved it for you, even though it's public parking. And like I never wanted to take those parking spaces because it's like because even though they don't own that parking space, they feel entitled after you take that space because they've kind of like shown you the way in there. And so, anyways, we were driving and we were kind of tired, and my wife's like, "Hey, you need to go and park there." I'm like, "No, I don't want to." She's like, "Just go do it." I was like, "Okay, if we do that, I got to tip the guy though." And she's like, "No, you don't. Like, it's not his parking space." I'm like, "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to take the parking space, hop out, and not tip him after he asked. And then we're going to come out, and the rental car is going to have a key mark on it because he feels entitled to it." I'm not right. Like, it's not right by any means for us to like have to do that because it's not his parking space. But the real outcome of that is he feels entitled to it. And if he feels entitled to it, what is he going to do when he feels like I haven't given him what he's entitled to? And that's not to say like you have to use discretion in your life when you're like working with people that are aggressive and things like that. But like that's a good example of being right versus real. And like with the Palestinians in Gaza and all of our actions in the Middle East, like what is the real perspective of our actions there? It's like even if we grant ourselves that we're just in what we're doing over there, we're definitely not by any means. Anyone who's read anything knows we're not. But even if we grant that, like just take the real position that like we're literally killing family members and millions of them and starving other further millions of them. Like what kind of real response are we going to get from people regardless of whether they are right or wrong? And it's I this is the same thing that's occurring, you know, in Palestine. And it's just crazy to me that people won't acknowledge that's just the reality of things. If you kill someone's mother, brother, sister, the person that's left over is probably going to harbor anger in their heart unless they have some sort of transformative encounter with Jesus Christ. And I don't think that's like something you can really bank on when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah, I wish it was.
That would be
I
awesome
really
if you
do.
could, but you can't.
Yeah. Well, and the crazy thing too about I think we get into this maybe in another take here, but the crazy thing about pulling up Japan is not a good example to pull for this kind of thing because we obliterated a lot more of them than we needed to, and there's so much historical evidence surrounding how the peace deals that we negotiated were or weren't going to, they were basically the same up to the point, and then we just murdered a bunch of them. But also just that you look at the history of China and Japan and Korea, and it's like there were long lasting feuds there, and it really did take, like you mentioned, that sort of reconstruction type behavior before we were able to actually achieve peace. And I'm not saying it was the best way to do it, but what we're talking about with the Israel Hamas situation is not that. We're talking about, quote unquote, going in and obliterating them and then keeping the people enslaved in a way where they feel like they are still second class citizens and they are still being indiscriminately attacked and torn. And that's not what we did in Japan. What we did in Japan was horrible, but we didn't continue terrorism, strikes there. We didn't, we did disallow a standing army, but we didn't have like U.S. soldiers going in and then telling all the Japanese citizens, hey, we control when you go outside, when you don't. We control X, Y, or Z. We're going to have random runs of killing your kids. Like that didn't happen. And if you're not acknowledging that that's what's going on in Israel, then you're not even reading Israeli news, man.
Yep.
Because like, this recent Israeli strike on the aid, there was like this strike on like an aid convoy. And even the Israeli newspapers are writing about it like this tragedy. But you listen to American news and we will not acknowledge it. We'll say like, oh no, Israel has never hit a target in their life except for one time, maybe when there were 1,000 terrorists that were holding one innocent person, and that innocent person was 80 years old and dying of cancer anyway, and that's it. It's like that's the level that our media is on, when even like Israeli media is like, no, actually, like, this was super not justified. And that's, not to say that the Israeli media is right or wrong, but it just shows that we only get a really, really one-sided perspective over here. And even when Israel is very unified, as they are right now, I would say even the leftist factions of Israel are pretty united, as countries tend to be when they are in times of war. Even still, the media is like, no, wait, we need to take a step back. What we struck here was wrong. And the US isn't even doing that. So hopefully that should give some people a little bit of consideration as to what you think we may or may not be getting when it comes to content. So I don't know, just something to think about.
I'll have more on this one.
All right, let's move on then to is this our last one? I think it is. All right, this one comes from Bev Jackson. It was retweeted by J.K. Rowling, and it reads, "The idea that someone born male can be a lesbian is not an April Fool's joke. It is an insult arising from the revolting pornification of lesbians that has long appealed to a certain type of straight men." Okay, what do you make of this tweet here?
Yeah, so I don't know as much of like I'm a straight man married to a straight woman, and so I don't know much about like the whole sociological culture around lesbians, but I do know like how porn does twist a person's brain, and we were talking about this before the show, and I realized I kind of stated it wrong. Like I got the genders that they were identifying as wrong. So I in 2008, I was like on MySpace, and I was a fan of this band. I think it was called Nice Guys Finish First. What a silly band name. It was an email band. And it was there was a biological male in it, and then a female, biological female in the band. And the guy identified as gay, and then the gal identified as like transgender male or whatever. And so they eventually like hooked up together, because like that's what happens when you have two members of the opposite sex like in close proximity, doing good work to not good work, but doing work together and like being intimate in ways other than just physical. That usually happens. That's why it's important, if you're married, like, to your best friend and only female friend should probably be your wife. Outside of that, you shouldn't have you shouldn't have really close relationships with members of the opposite sex. But anyway, so these guys hooked up and they justified it. They justified it as like, oh well, it's still in line with my identity because I'm a gay man, and this my band member, even though she's a biological female, she identifies as a man, so I'm technically dating a man. It's like, no, that's just straight. You're just straight at that point. And I think that like when I saw this take, it made me think of that. And it's just, people, regardless of whether you are doing it because you've been addicted to porn and the pornification of lesbians, and it appeals to you as a straight man, and you're like living out some weird fantasy, or you're in this, this band, Nice Guys Finish First, and you've got this other stereotype thing going on. Like it all of it is just a justification to do what is wrong and for you to feel good about it. And it's even in the way that I'm having a difficult time like remembering who is who and what is what, like it makes it impossible to like have any sort of coherence about like what you're supposed to do or function in the world, and how you describe people and how you're supposed to think of people. And like people will say that that's like being you're being bigoted, because it's like, well, what's it matter to you how you think of people? It's like, well, that's how you interact with the world. Is you see people, you think about them, and you think about how you're supposed to interact with them. And if you constantly make it so that the power of how someone is defined is only being able to be defined by the person that you're thinking about, like if they can keep redefining it, then you have no definition. There is no shape to, that's what definition means. There is no actual shape to what is going on. And to define is to say like, these are the edges of something. And to say that there is no edges, that you can be anything you want, means to actually, you don't actually know anything about anything. And so it's just really like, it sounds so ridiculous to talk about it. And that's why I liked this guy said, like, it's not an April Fool's joke. It's because it does feel like a joke. It's like, feels so ridiculous to have to take on this biological reality. But I think it's just the result of just a sinful culture that has chosen to be at the whim of their own desires. And the more we choose to be at the whim of our desires and not at the whim and subjugation of an actual principle that goes regardless of whether we like it or not, the more irrational we will become.
So one thing I like about this take is that it is it's almost blissfully unaware of the implications that it says, which are kind of true. The underlying principle and argument here is that, as you kind of were talking about with definitions and having meaning and things, right? That there is a definition to lesbian, and the pornification or what I would just kind of overall call the over sexualization of the culture has now created a perversion which leads people into trying to be something or create something that is not, or they are not. That's kind of the essence of this message. And what I love about this is that this is the exact kind of argument that Christians have been making about marriage for a long time.
Yes.
Which is the idea that a male can be married to a male is not an April Fool's joke. It's an insult arising from the over-sexualization of our culture that appeals to people who don't want to hold to chastity and virtuous biblical principles. That could be this tweet in another life. I think this person, Bev Jackson, probably would take a lot of issue with it. But the reality is the same, where marriage is a specifically defined institution. It is between men and women, and it is done within the sacred bonds of Christianity. And the state sort of has co-opted that to make it its own thing, and then that's where you get this sort of distortion. And that, of course, is also happening now with things like the hate crime bill that we talked about in Scotland earlier, where the state is getting involved and making these assertions about reality and shifting the terms and changing the definitions and creating standards that are just contrary to nature. So in the same way that I would say, for instance, that, the state recognizing gay marriage, or even marriage of infidelity, or marriage of all kinds of sinful marriage, that can happen with straight people, but is definitionally not marriage when it is not done between a man and a woman. This person also would complain that a male being born cannot definitionally define themselves as a lesbian, and the state is now coming in and saying that if you hold that view, you have to be criminalized and silenced, and we must allow the definition of lesbian to now include that. And so, even if our different framings and perspectives are different, maybe if I'm much more conservative and traditional and orthodox in my views, at least relative to the last, thousands of years of history, that's fine. You can say that I'm wrong in that view, and that's fine. I think that this person, Bev Jackson, is wrong in where they draw their line. They have the Gay
Yes.
Liberation Front profile picture. That's fine. But what we can agree on, hopefully, I think this person may disagree, but what the underlying principle I read from this and from my example is that when the state gets involved, it takes the natural disorders of society and then codifies them and
So
empowers
good.
them. And that is the number one issue, because it's one thing to have a culture war. I think no matter what kind of society we live in, whether it's a Christian nationalist country or a country with no government, no matter where we live, we're going to have cultural persuasions that are wrong and that are worth fighting over, not with guns and swords, but fighting the cultural battle of words and ideas. But what you can almost guarantee is that governments will 100% of the time get something wrong about it. And that's where the issue comes. And again, I mean, like, look at church history, and you look at the persecution of Catholics, the persecution of Protestants by those same governments. And it's like, even if, from our perspective right now, it's like, I would, if you're a Catholic, you're like, I'd love to be a Huguenot in France, under their government compared to the culture we live in now. Or, like, I would gladly be a Roman Catholic under Mary's reign in England compared to the culture and the values we have now. It's like, but even then, you had these miserable government actions that were executing people because of the distinction in theology of these different areas. So no matter where we shift what our ideal society is in terms of the values, you can't just say, well, the government just needs to have those values, because they're inevitably going to do something wrong. In the case of Christian governments, I think it's persecution and blood over many things, and now it's persecution and blood over the differentiation of ideas that are contrary to this cultural Marxist norm, I think.
Yes. I don't have any more on this one.
All right, well, that's it. Hopefully you did not think we were too arrogant. If we were wrong, though, please comment. We're happy to take it, all in good fun. Seriously, let us know what we got wrong and what you think we should have said, or if you have any takes, send them our way. Make sure to like and comment. All that good stuff helps us out a ton, and we'll catch you on the next one.